Hello everyone, I am Nathan P. Butler. This is my vlog, The Voice of Reason or Lack Thereof, and this is an episode answering your questions. Back in vlog numbers 9 and 10, I did the same type of thing, a sort of viewer Q&A, and in vlog number 10, I pointed sort of downward into the comments and said, hey, if you've got questions that you want to see answered on a future Q&A, then post the questions here, and once I've got quite a few, we'll do another episode. So, that's what this is, and again, the same rules apply. You are more than welcome to post new questions in the comments below this video, and when you do that, I'll gather up those questions and use them for a future Q&A. I would point out that those questions that were already answered in episodes 9 and 10, I'm going to try not to answer again. Honestly, though, I really don't recall which have or haven't been answered. Thankfully, I and others were policing that within the comments to note which ones were and weren't already answered previously. So hopefully, if I and others have pointed out which ones were already answered effectively, we shouldn't have any redundancy here with episodes 9 or 10 of the vlog. So, picking up here, we have Star Wars Uncovered from YouTube, who asks, what are your favorite canon Star Wars novel, comic, video game, or film? And I already answered all but the video game part of that in a previous episode and noted on YouTube that I would answer the video game part in the next Q&A. And here we are. So my favorite Star Wars video game of all time is going to have to be The Force Unleashed. I've played a lot of them over the years, but I love a good Star Wars story, and I really like the Star Killer character. Galen Merrick and such, and the way that he fit into the founding of the Rebel Alliance and such, at least in what's now the Legends continuity, since that story doesn't even exist in the new story group canon. Really enjoyed being able to play with all the different Force abilities and whatnot. I'm a fan of a lot of different styles of video games, but that type, which is sort of the, sometimes people call it like a God of War clone type of game, it's just a fun way to do a Star Wars romp and get some good storytelling out of the way as well. I did like The Force Unleashed 2. I thought it was a little more refined, but its story was way too short, and I much prefer the story of the original Star Killer to the story of his clone. I really wish there had been a The Force Unleashed 3 to wrap up that story, instead of ending with the whole, I let you live, and Vader somehow being in custody and somehow escaping that we've never seen resolved within the Legends continuity. But The Force Unleashed, definitely my favorite Star Wars game. I would love to have been able to say that Battlefront was a favorite, because it looks gorgeous and it's got a VR segment to it, the current Battlefront, but not so much, because the game was very, very lacking, though I did really love that VR segment. We have some questions here from J.L. Lichter. Now, he asked one question that had two parts that was already answered in episodes 9 and 10 of the vlog, so we're dumping that one. The other two questions are essentially asking the same thing, so I'll just use the one more elaborate way that he phrased this. The question is, hey Nathan, here's another question. What is your favorite Nickelodeon 90s cartoon, like 1990s cartoon? I know you love Star Wars and watch other stuff, but would you ever do a 90s cartoon channel, or cover 90s cartoons on the channel? I gotta be honest, I don't have the slightest idea what the cartoons of Nickelodeon in the 1990s even would have been. By the time we get to the 1990s, I'm in middle school into high school, and I don't think I watched any cartoons on Nickelodeon at that point. For me, the cartoons of my childhood were like the 80s stuff, and mostly not Nickelodeon. For me, Nickelodeon was more for stuff like, hey, dude, and you can't do that on television, where you say water or I don't know, and shit falls from the sky, or Double Dare and things like that. I was much less into any of the Nickelodeon cartoons than I was their live-action stuff. And from a cartoon standpoint, it was always stuff like Transformers, Thundercats, G.I. Joe, all the stuff you would expect in the 1980s. Or from a funny cartoon standpoint, stuff usually going back to like Looney Tunes, which a lot of times were just replays of Looney Tunes cartoons from way before the 1980s, whether they were replaying on Nickelodeon or elsewhere. So watched a lot of 80s cartoons. 1990s, hard to say. The only 1990s cartoon I think I watched religiously, so to speak, wasn't a Nickelodeon one, and it was the X-Men cartoon series on Fox, because I was big into the X-Men comics in the early 90s, back around the time that they did the big relaunch with X-Men #1 and X-Force #1 and so on and so on. So, unfortunately, don't really have anything that I can say about the Nickelodeon 90s cartoons. And no, I don't think I'd ever include that type of content on the channel because I'm not an expert in it, and there's tons and tons of channels out there that have far more in-depth content on that kind of stuff than I'd be able to present. That said, at least if we're talking 80s cartoons, I can put a recommendation out there, which is this sucker, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, a character guide and world compendium. This is basically an encyclopedia to all the He-Man stuff, but what's cool about it is it hits every different continuity. So we're talking the cartoon, the early mini-comics, the later mini-comics, the stuff from MV Creations, the stuff from DC Comics, the Mike Young cartoon series, the New Adventures of He-Man. Every entry in here, when there's a significant variance between different continuities for a particular character, vehicle, or whatever, it notes those differences in their own little entries for those continuities. It is a fascinating look for anybody who's into He-Man stuff. But again, not Nickelodeon, not 90s, but still cartoon fare. Good stuff. Vince Lipari asks, "Hey Nathan, do you watch Game of Thrones? Also, as a student of history, I recommend Boardwalk Empire. It's an HBO drama, a fictionalized history of 1920s Prohibition in Atlantic City. Amazing show. My favorite." I have not checked out Boardwalk Empire. It's not really been on my radar. I'll have to kind of keep an eye on that the next time we decide to turn on the HBO Now subscription, or whatever it's called. Basically what we wind up doing, I am a viewer of Game of Thrones. What we'll do is we'll wait for Game of Thrones to be totally done with a season, and then subscribe to the monthly app-based version of it, of the HBO service, binge watch all of them, and then cancel it by the next month. So really we're only paying 1 month of HBO Now's fee to watch all of Game of Thrones. But that's pretty much all it is that we're watching. Although I am interested in some other stuff, we may bring that subscription back for a longer service term, just depending on how much time I have to watch stuff once some of my current marathons finally end. But definitely I'm a viewer of Game of Thrones. I think its quality has varied over time. I think, thankfully, it is now focusing more on the story than it is on, see, we're on HBO! Tits and dicks everywhere! They're actually going for something that's more story-based than just trying to have the shock value and the, see, this isn't TV. It's HBO, as they used to say it. That said, I'm also a reader of the Game of Thrones books, though I'm not sure how long that will continue, because, good God, George R.R. Martin's writing is ponderous as hell. He may be able to do some great twists and turns, and you never know who's safe, but generally speaking, almost every time you switch between segments, you're going to have the same phrases, the same narrative, narration segments repeated over and over and over and over again. You hear the same crap. You're told the same stuff so often that basically the last book could have been 200 pages shorter if the repetitive shit wasn't in there. So, for me, Game of Thrones for the first 2 or 3 books was a great read, and it enhanced my enjoyment of the TV series. After about that point, the TV series has harmed my enjoyment of the books, because the TV series I can enjoy and say, hey, this is moving along at a nice clip. And the books bore the shit out of me, unfortunately. Kind of sad, though, because it had such promise, and then it turned into such a bloated bag of crap. But, anyway, I digress, at least a little bit. Yes, I watch Game of Thrones. My wife and I both do watch the series. A quasi-question here coming in from Banazir Gautsy, 1968, who says, need to hear about official Star Wars vinyl records. To which, unfortunately, my reply has to be, then you need to look elsewhere, because I have zero interest whatsoever in the Star Wars soundtracks. I mean, I've got some of them, collecting them, hunting them down, the history of them, none of that is really anything that I have a great interest in. So don't expect to have content about those topics on the channel here. There are many people out there who are more versed in that and doing good videos on it, so thankfully that content is out there, but it won't be found here. We have a few questions here from James Lawner. Number 1, what's your favorite Star Trek book, comic, movie, or show? Can't really say anything for the books, at least as far as the fiction books. I am a huge fan of the Star Trek Encyclopedia and the Star Trek Chronology, which unfortunately has only had 2 editions and then died long, long, long ago and hasn't had a new edition recently. Actually, the Star Trek Chronology by Michael and Denise Okuda was one of the inspirations for me in making my Star Wars Timeline project that became the Star Wars Timeline Gold. You'll see actually some similarities in the style of addressing certain things between what I do and that Star Trek chronology. So that one's great, but from the standpoint just of fiction, I really couldn't say. Comics, really the same thing. I don't read much. I've been reading the recent reboot, soft reboot continuity comics that are supposed to be canonical. They're all right, but they're not great, so I wouldn't even call that a favorite. Movies, kind of depends. If you're talking Next Generation era, then it'd be First Contact. If you're talking the original crew, either the duology of Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock, or it'd be The Undiscovered Country. I love the political parallels and allegory in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Overall, though, I actually find that I much more enjoy the more recent films, with Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, and that cast, the reboot, more than the original films. But that's because I'm a Star Wars fan, and as I said early on with the 11th film, these were the Star Trek films that Star Wars fans had been waiting for, because they move away from the deeper, more dramatic, sort of deep thought storytelling that you get with a lot of the original films and the original Star Trek series, and you get something that is much more flashy and adventure-driven in those newer films. Let's see. Number 2. Do you think Star Wars will still be relevant in 100 years? Possibly. I mean, I would argue that probably a lot of the things that are in the lexicon now, a lot of the things that have been added to the pop cultural phrasing of society, yeah, those types of things will probably still be around. And of course, Star Wars will be a big part of film history, cinematic history. It'll just be that that history has another 100 years dumped on top of it. Will it still be relevant as a viable business franchise? Still be producing new stories? That I couldn't say. I mean, there's a lot of Star Wars out there, and there are people who argued that it got too big, too expansive, too difficult to know anything about in depth with the Legends continuity, so that's why it, quote-unquote, needed a reboot whenever they launched the story group's new canon. And that was only after less than 40 years. You add 100 years to this, how many more reboots would we have to see to keep it viable up to that point? How many films would that be? We don't really see that type of thing happening with fictional franchises because film and TV just haven't been such a big part of pop culture for long enough to make that something we can really fully predict. I mean, even Doctor Who and Star Trek have only in the last little while hit their 50th anniversary. Star Wars is only now hitting its 40th anniversary. So, will it still be relevant? Culturally? Yes. Will it still be a viable franchise? Don't know. Hard to say. My guess would be not in its current form. In some other future iteration of the continuity? Maybe. And number 3, what do you think of Weird Al's Star Wars song? He's saying that singular, so I'm not sure which one he's referring to. There are multiple Star Wars songs by Weird Al. If he's referring to Yoda or Saga Begins, I enjoy them both. I will say that I feel like he's got better songs out there than the Star Wars ones, but it is cool to see Star Wars as represented through it, especially given that Yoda was much more of sort of a funny take, still telling part of the story of The Empire Strikes Back, whereas Saga Begins isn't really designed to be particularly comedic. It's not super funny, but it's a way of taking American Pie and giving us a song that's basically a retelling of The Phantom Menace. So I like them, but I do think that Weird Al Yankovic has a lot better stuff out there. I actually have all of his stuff from the original just Weird Al Yankovic album all the way up through the most recent, all digitized or bought digitally as MP3s now on a disc that I have in my car. So I can always put in that disc, that CDR, into my car and play the MP3s of the entire Weird Al library. It's still out there. I still listen to it pretty regularly. Just the Star Wars songs aren't the ones that really stand out to me at this point anymore. All right. Questions coming in from Joshua Breen. Number 1, will the book, that is A Saga on Home Video, a fan's guide to U.S. Star Wars home video releases, available on Amazon.com. Definitely check it out. My new book, will it be released in the UK? And yes, you can actually get it on the various Amazon sites, and Amazon.co.uk is one of them. I believe you can also get it through other channels now if you order it by the ISBN number, which is available seen on Amazon, but it's much faster and easier to get it if you just order through Amazon in whatever your particular region happens to be. He also asks, who would your favorite Jedi and Sith be, and why? I think in most cases these are going to be the same people. I would say probably my favorite Jedi and Sith, at least within all of Star Wars, would probably be Ulic Qel-Droma. I would have said Cade Skywalker, but he barely embraces the idea of being a Jedi, and while he joins the one Sith temporarily, he doesn't really embrace their philosophy. So it'd be hard for me to call Cade Skywalker, who is probably my favorite Star Wars character, to call him either a Jedi or a Sith. So leaving him out, it defers back to my second favorite, which is Ulic Qel-Droma. I like the idea of a Jedi who is confident enough in himself and sees the desperation in a time of war to decide to basically try to defeat the dark side from the inside, and in doing so manages to get himself corrupted, become a sort of conflicted Sith, doing things he thinks are for the right reasons, but doing horrible things in the process, seeking his own redemption, being punished by the person that he loves in a way that strips him of what he thinks makes him who he is, only to find himself finding redemption through the eyes of and through tutoring the daughter of that love interest who, you know, there but for the grace of God, could have even been his own child, or a stepchild in that relationship had things gone differently. I love that dynamic. So Ulic Qel-Droma, definitely him. You can find his story if you're not familiar with him in the Tales of the Jedi comic series from the Legends continuity. He is featured in the first 3 issues of the original miniseries, and then Nomi Sunrider who's that love interest, is in the last 2 issues of that. Or maybe it was 2 and then 3, I forget, it's been a while. But that first series is also known as just Knights of the Old Republic, as a trade paperback, Tales of the Jedi, Knights of the Old Republic, or Tales of the Jedi, the Collection you can also see it as. It's in one of the Omnibuy too. And then he shows up again in Tales of the Jedi, the Freed Nat Uprising, Dark Lords of the Sith, and the Sith War. And then finally his redemption story is, appropriately enough, in Tales of the Jedi Redemption. A character whose story is driven by Tom Beach and Kevin J. Anderson, mostly. We got some questions here from Sam Star 2, who asked quite a few questions previously, I believe. We have, let's see, number 1. What would you think would happen if Disney never bought Lucasfilm? Honestly, if Disney never bought Lucasfilm, A, we would not have seen a reboot of the continuity. We wouldn't see the Legends continuity as its own thing, and this new story group canon being built. We probably would have seen the Legends continuity continue to grow, and continue to have to grow in areas and ways and with characters that are outside of the films, because the lives of the film characters are so chock full of different events within the bulk of the time that we see. I think we probably would have seen Clone Wars continue on to a natural resolution, and may never have seen a show like Rebels, and more than likely we probably wouldn't be seeing new Star Wars movies either. That said, maybe we would have finally seen a Blu-ray 3D home video release of the prequels, because they already exist in 3D format, but I kind of doubt it, because we still haven't seen that with Phantom Menace or any of the other prequels, really, and 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment could put that out even today, and they still haven't. That said, I'm not sure then that Star Wars would have had the revitalization within pop culture as it has had. I would say that it probably would be fading in relevance rather than growing again in pop culture relevance. Number 2, would you like to see Star Wars characters cross over with any Disney characters like Avengers? No. No. Well, mostly no. For video games that are obviously, or other things that are obviously not meant to be canonical, like, say, Disney Infinity, sure, why not? Toss them in there together. A Lego game, sure, why not? Toss them in together. But anything that anyone in their right mind could possibly confuse as being canonical, hell no. Because that's just frustrating. Like, as I said in, I guess it was an earlier part of this video. It's already been a while. I was a fan of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe back in the day, and some of the different iterations of it over time. Well, the newest DC Comics version of Masters of the Universe has the fact that, and so did some previous continuity versions, that He-Man, or Prince Adam's mom, is actually from Earth, not from Eternia. Well, in the newer DC continuity, that causes them to wind up interacting with DC superheroes in a big event, and it's not something that can be set aside, like, you know, I think there's like a Star Trek meets Green Lantern thing, and you can just ignore that pretty much entirely. It doesn't have a big effect on the rest of, you know, either series. Ignore the crossover, it's stupid, just read the stuff that actually is meant to be continuity. But in the case of Masters of the Universe, that was an integral part of that continuity. Things happened in that miniseries of the crossover with DC characters that were necessary to make the rest of the series make sense. And that drives me nuts because it feels like it's undermining the integrity of that saga. So, to have something like, here's a Star Wars story, but look, from a dimensional portal comes Goofy and Mickey. Or, from a dimensional portal, here come the Avengers. No. No. No, 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 no. Please don't do that, because all of a sudden you start entering the idea of parallel universes and such and travel between them into Star Wars, and oh yeah, you're telling stories that aren't really Star Wars in theme or feel. Thankfully, unless there's time travel involved, if Star Wars is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, if someone, say, from Avengers in modern day just traveled to the parallel universe of the galaxy far, far away, unless that parallel time jump, or that parallel universe jump has a time jump involved, like what happened in Injustice Gods Among Us for DC characters, they'd be jumping to the far, far, far future of Star Wars, not the Star Wars that we know and love. Thank God. Question 3. Are there any foreign Star Wars home video items that aren't in English or Spanish that you want to get? Like the Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones widescreen VHS from Sweden. Not sure why Sweden would be a particular example here. Honestly, not really. Honestly, the reason I had those Spanish ones was that a friend of mine had those copies, and they were just sitting around, and he's like, hey, you want these? I'll give them to you, sell them to you, whatever. So really, for me, it's all about the English language ones because I want to be able to actually watch them and understand them if I can. And I don't pick up a lot of releases outside of the UK from regions that can't be played on American players. So, not really. I mean, I like picking up the Japanese ones because I've got quite a few of them, and theoretically many of them could play in US players because of the whole NTSC formatting thing. But not especially. I think if I was going to search out non-English foreign releases that aren't from Japan, probably my next thing I would be searching for is Russian, if I could find a way to play them on American players, because I took a little bit of Latin back in high school. I took some Russian in college and just have an interest in those languages. You're not going to see Star Wars in Latin, but seeing Star Wars in Russian would be kind of cool. But, you know, it's just not something that I've really taken to hunting down or anything. Number 4, what is the most expensive Star Wars home video item you have ever bought? I would say the single most expensive would probably wind up being, it may be the Definitive Collection Laserdisc set previously, but that price would be on par with the 20th Century Fox Anniversary set that has Star Wars stuff in it. The full set of the Ewoks VHS stuff, along with Great Heap as one big eBay auction, maybe. It's hard to say. Probably the one that is the most expensive and most valuable is actually one that Brian Snook actually just sold me. I covered it recently, well, not that recently. I covered it on From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I covered just this little DVD from the Sculpting the Galaxy limited edition book. He let me borrow the DVD to show you the real thing. But I didn't have the book or anything in front of me because those are really expensive, really hard to find, and sell for very, very high prices. He recently started liquidating part of his collection and has recently sold the book and everything to me for Sculpting a Galaxy, the limited edition, deluxe edition. So I'll be able to show that on the show in the near future and focus on those other items, not just the DVD that was already covered. I would say that that one, while price-wise it's on par with some other stuff that I've bought before, the value compared to the price that he is selling it to me for is significantly higher. So if we're talking like how valuable something is, the most expensive, if someone were to try to buy it elsewhere, that would probably be it. But I don't have it in my hands yet to show anybody. We have a couple of questions here from Troy Patterson. First, do you think in 30 years or sooner Star Wars will be rebooted again? I think that if Star Wars remains viable as a franchise and grows at the rate and to the extent that the Legends continuity did, then someday, yes, there will have to be another reboot. Whether it's 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, even sooner, it really just kind of depends. But it all depends on how viable it is as a business franchise going forward. Right now, we probably have decades before that kind of thing would be necessary again. And then Troy also asks, how do you feel about Legends now that it's not canon? I still love it, maybe even more. Well, let's clarify one thing. Legends was never canonical on par with the films. In Star Wars, prior to the Disney buyout, the term canon was tossed around willy-nilly and meant a lot of different things. For some people, it was canon and quasi-canon, or canon and official, or maybe it was all canon, but then there's like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit version of Star Wars, and then there's fandom stuff, and the terms were thrown around so much that they became meaningless because so many people were using them in different ways. I mean, if I look up the word bad in the dictionary, and the first definition is what we think of as bad, but the second definition is what we think of as good, and the third definition is what we think of as then what the hell good does it do to have the word bad in our language? Thankfully, eventually, they did say, okay, so for the Legends continuity, there are different levels. And they use the word canon again. They probably shouldn't have. But they use the word canon again to define those levels of G canon, T canon, C canon, S canon, and then eventually N canon as well as the non-continuity stuff, but just to give it a name. But it's never been canon on par with the films, ever. That just isn't the way that it was designed to be. If you're meaning just basically how do you feel about Legends now that it's not the main Star Wars continuity, and it is not. Now it's canon that they're focusing on, the new canon, which now has a name that actually means something because they're not bandying the name around to mean a bunch of different things. And now the books and comics and TV series and everything are considered on par with the films in the way that the new canon is working. How do I feel about Legends now that it's no longer the main continuity? I think I still feel the same about it. I'm not as passionate about finding new stuff for it because there just isn't much of it out there at this point. I've sort of reconciled myself to the fact that it's not going to continue expanding with the exception of the stuff happening in the Old Republic MMO, and every once in a while references that could fit either continuity and really isn't in either necessarily that it comes from Fantasy Flight Games. So it's nice. It's a great continuity. That said, if you look behind me, a lot of shelves back here. These shelves, you can see these towers. There's actually 4 of them, not just the 3 that you see. And this big black bookcase, there's actually a whole other one on the other side of that. This entire wall is nothing but Star Wars books, and it's overflowing. I'm running out of space. I had to take some of the bigger ones and put them in a, Jedi Path and stuff like that, and put them inside of a Rubbermaid tub that is now underneath the window in my office. I have finite space in here, and I'm running out of it already after our move. So, I have frequently come back to the idea of, well, maybe I'll take some of my Legends collection and just package it up in Rubbermaid tubs or something for safekeeping and sit it elsewhere so that the shelves can be filled more with the canonical stuff as that stuff is being released. I'm hesitant to do that, though, because it is such a big, expansive, important library, and it is such a big part of my Star Wars experience over the years. There was a point at which I even considered, well, maybe I ought to just sell the whole thing, because it is a large, very comprehensive, but not necessarily 100%, collection, depending on how you want to judge comprehensive or not. I don't think I'm going to wind up doing that. I'm not sure I'd be able to get enough money out of it, and selling the whole collection to anybody would be a massive, massive shipping cost. I'd probably need a big truck just for that. But certainly I think my passion for rereading it, my tendency to frequently delve back into it or anything like that isn't as great. Because when I'm working on my Star Wars Timeline Gold, now the bulk of the new material is coming for that new continuity, and that's what I got to be reading through, researching, and getting onto the document for the new releases each year. Kenny Crayley asks, hello Nate, what are your thoughts on the current canon Star Wars comics from Marvel so far? I've talked about this a lot on Star Wars Beyond the Films, but I feel like the Star Wars comics from Marvel right now started really strong, and then kind of floundered, and now they're kind of getting into a better mode. So like the first arc of the regular Star Wars series, Skywalker Strikes, and the first arc of the Darth Vader comic series, the first Darth Vader comic series, just called Vader, that's not confusing at all, those are really good arcs. For the most part, I enjoyed them. I've enjoyed some of the new characters they introduced, especially in Darth Vader, like Dr. Aphra and 000 and BT-1 and so forth. But then after that, we got some really piss-poor, pretty crappy miniseries like Princess Leia. You know, that's not Leia! Because the characterization was completely wrong and screwed up for Leia. Unless you could picture the Carrie Fisher Leia from the films sitting around whining like an emo teenager saying, well, I do such and such, and things would stop going wrong for 2 minutes! Or whatever the hell it is that she said. 2 minutes, 2 seconds. Just a horrible portrayal of Leia. And the Chewbacca comic series that was useless, and parts of it didn't make any damn sense because they wouldn't want to have Chewbacca talking or translate something. So here's an ending to the story that doesn't make any sense to anyone, except the writer who probably, hopefully, knew what the hell he was trying to do. But then you got stuff that's sort of middle of the road, like the Lando series. You got stuff that's stronger, like the Poe Dameron series, although the Poe Dameron series is driving me nuts, because there's only supposed to be a little bit of time between Poe's part of the book before the Awakening and The Force Awakens. And in the middle, that's where the Poe Dameron comic takes place. And yet, it seems like it's just going to keep going, and the more that it goes, the more it widens that gap in a way that Before the Awakening wasn't meant to be providing. It's not meant to be saying, here we go, we're going to go search for Lor San Tekka. It wasn't meant to say, and it's going to take us months. It was supposed to be, here we go, we're going to find Lor San Tekka. He's on his way to Jakku, kind of stuff. The fact that there was going to be this long comic series in between doesn't seem like it was actually originally in the cards. And yes, it does apparently turn out, according to recent reports, that even for the sequel trilogy, they're not actually planning a whole lot ahead. They're not giving a lot of major plot points to the people writing the movies and saying, now you must write it this way. They're letting them sort of do their thing, and as long as it fits with their vision, they're fine with it, and then they're kind of tweaking other things that they're making to make it better fit and dovetail into the films and such, which is a fine way of doing it, but it's also not a grand plan, as the Poe Dameron comic, to me, epitomizes. So far, I have been enjoying the new Dr. Aphra series and the crossover The Screaming Citadel, but mainly because I like to see how Aphra interacts with the other characters and such, whereas I really wasn't a big fan of the Vader Down crossover the first time they did a major Star Wars crossover for the new Marvel stuff. So I feel like they're sort of middle of the road. They've done some pretty good stuff, but most of it has been utterly forgettable, and some of it just downright crap. They definitely need to up their game if they're going to bring the Marvel Comics new Star Wars stuff in line quality-wise with some of the newer books that we're getting. And certainly, in a lot of ways, both lines are going to have to bring it up to par from a film standpoint. But, yeah, so Marvel is improving recently after a great start and a really bad stretch in the middle. Question from Addie Marvin. Addie Marvin asks, and there's a couple of them, is there any Star Wars medium that's helping expand the new canon that you do not collect? And also, what are your thoughts on different variant covers for the comic books? Stuff that I don't collect that's actually applying to the new canon, not really. Not that I can think of. Picking up books, comics, the games really aren't doing much in that regard, but I picked them up as well. I guess the closest thing would be like, if there's a mobile game or something like that, I may or may not pick it up. I may ignore it. I may check it out. It just depends on what the game is. But that's really about it that I can think of. Thoughts on different variant covers for comic books? It's nifty in small doses to make them things so that a collector can go, oh, cool, here's something to chase after. You know, the chase is the fun part of collecting sometimes. To have it be, a special one for a certain event, or a special one for a signing, or one of those blank covers that you can have an artist create a special cover just for you for, and stuff like that. On the other hand, as I've covered a lot of times on Star Wars Beyond the Films, Marvel's practice of tons and tons of variant covers, like having over 100 different variant covers for Star Wars #1, is completely fucking insane. It's idiotic. It's too much. It's too much, because they're creating massive amounts of covers, and one, it pads their numbers. They can go out and legitimately say, Star Wars #1 was the best-selling comic of this particular time period, or for our company for this particular whatever. The problem is that their sales numbers don't differentiate and say how many people bought multiple copies because they made 100+ motherfucking covers. So, it takes away to some degree the legitimacy of them being able to say this was the #1 comic. Well, that's lovely and all, but how about you adjust that down and tell us how many individual customers bought the comic, not telling us how many copies were sold, because some people are buying 50, 60, 70 different versions to try to collect them all, Pokemon style. I really don't like it, because I know people, I don't do it, but I know people who try to collect every single variant, and they're going broke and pulling their hair out trying to get every copy of some of these variant covers. We should not be 20 issues or something into a Star Wars comic series, and they're still putting out 3 to 5 or more variant covers for each damn issue. That is asinine. So in limited numbers, sure. But Marvel is really sort of taking the cake for padding their sales and driving collectors nuts by having way more variants than individual issues actually merit. There should be a reason an issue is so special that it merits a variant cover. Not every issue having numerous different covers, because all that is a money play, which, granted, it's capitalism, fine, whatever. To me, it's distasteful, but, again, that's how capitalism works. They can put out as many variant covers as they like, and I can bitch about it all I like, but when it comes down to it, just as they can choose whether or not to put out the variant covers, we consumers can choose whether or not to pick them up, or whether to pick up anything from Marvel at all. The fact that apparently enough people are picking them up to justify it just means they're going to keep doing it, unfortunately. Also, question from Abby Marvin. I know the fandom can be quite colorful being as large as it is, so my question is, what is your worst and or most memorable bad experience dealing with a Star Wars fan regarding a Star Wars subject? Yike. I would say that, we're talking way early back in the day when I first got online back in the mid-90s. I was a big part of the Discuss the Prequels message board for Star Wars at Keyword Star Wars back on AOL way back in the days, where I met actually some Star Wars fans that are still friends of mine today. Jeremy Christopher's, his Cat Murdo, for instance. But I would say that back then, I had a lot of bad interactions. Back when I was sort of the know-it-all, I'm a late teens, early 20s guy. I know everything because my knowledge of Star Wars is superior to yours. You're an idiot kind of stuff. I had a really bad attitude at the time. I was really egotistical, very arrogant in how I dealt with others. And there was an ongoing back and forth constantly for probably a good couple of years with an AOL poster who went by, I believe, D-Horn123 was the name. I don't know if it's Dark Horn or the guy's name was like David Horn or what. And that, I don't say that was a bad experience per se, but it was just you should never get to a point where the online bickering between two individuals becomes that long-standing. For God's sake, it's a hobby. I needed to mature. I have since matured. But back then, when I was immature, as were most of the people around us, that was just sort of a crap experience all around. I would say in later years, really, some of the hatred spewed my way for some opinions on Chrono Radio and elsewhere from people who just couldn't handle it. Most recently, I would say that there were a couple of groups online who took to attacking me and of course, tearing into me and flaming me on private Facebook groups where theoretically I shouldn't have been able to see it. Thankfully, I knew people who were in them who screen captured stuff and sent it to me, so not nearly as private as they thought that their rants were. Because I dare to be a fan who can be intellectually honest enough to say, okay, it's all Star Wars. I can choose for myself, and so can other fans, whether I'm going to follow and enjoy the Legends continuity or the new canon or anything else. I personally am able to enjoy each of those two major continuities without it somehow meaning that I'm a traitor to Star Wars. So a lot of that stuff I would consider a negative experience. And from a podcasting standpoint, and really the timeline to some degree, I've run into issues of plagiarism before, where people have either ripped off parts of my Star Wars Timeline Gold, claiming it's their own, or putting it out with no attribution, which pissed me off. Or in the case of podcasting, there was a podcast that was released and launched that's gone now, but I want to say at their second episode, I think it was the second episode, they blatantly ripped off the opening and quite a bit of the format of Chrono Radio at the time, which was my podcast at the time, to the point where we had a back and forth that was pretty ugly for a while before they admitted, yeah, I did pretty much rip you off, and fixed it for upcoming episodes and put out a revised version of that episode that didn't rip off my intro and so forth. But, you know, I don't think any of that is stuff that I would say is something that negatively affected my fandom to the point where I wanted to say screw it or anything like that. It's just, you know, you can't expect an experience in anything to be all positive, and thankfully there are few enough of those little type of blips of ugliness that I can actually remember them specifically rather than being too many to count. Getting down to, I believe, 3 questions left now. We have one from Strat Pack, that is Ricky Ray, who has been so kind as to donate some stuff from the Star Wars Home Video Library before. And he says, "Hi Nathan, What's your thoughts on physical media releases for films these days? Do you think there will always be a physical release of sorts 20 years from now? Will it all be streamed? Everyone around me seems to say physical media is dying, but movies are still being released on DVD, never mind Blu-ray. I can't see a time where movies, also TV and music for that matter, will never be available in some physical music format, even on a limited run. There's too much of a collector's market for box sets, tie-ins, etc. It's hard to do with streamed or downloaded products. We actually just talked about this for video games on Cloud City Casino. I'm not even sure if the episode is even out yet. It's a Cloud City Casino at StarWarsReport.com. Me and Michael Morris were talking about the games industry and whatnot. But I think that physical copies, at least from a collecting standpoint, will be around for possibly forever. I mean, they're going to stick around. It's hard to imagine us getting to a point where there aren't physical releases at all, because you would have to get the buying audience acclimated to the idea of digital only. We're probably going to need to be like 2, 3, 4, 5 generations of Americans, let alone people in other parts of the world and other markets, before the idea of physical media becomes quaint and old-fashioned rather than digital. I'm remembering, the kid with the video game in Back to the Future 2. You mean you got to use your hands? That's like a baby's toy. Well, we got to get to a point where the kids are going to look at this and be like, why would I want it on physical media? And even now, you still see physical media still being bought even by younger generations, though not in as big a quantities. You'd also have to address things like what happens to purchases if a company goes out of business, or if the distribution rights to a certain product change from one company to another. We're already seeing that with, say, Star Wars, for instance, where if you bought Star Wars comics from Dark Horse digitally, you can still download them and read them, but you can't buy any new ones from them. If you're buying new stuff, it goes through Comixology and such, because that's where the digital stuff from Marvel has been taken. And questions like, well, what if Barnes & Noble goes out of business and it takes down not just their physical stores, but it also takes down their Nook platform for ebooks? What happens to all of my ebooks? That's why a lot of people made the jump from Nook, including me, from Nook to Kindle at one point, because it looked like Barnes & Noble was perhaps going to discontinue some of their Nook support. A lot of issues involved with digital material, not least of which is the fact that we also have the impact on retail stores. Because if you are selling things digitally, you're able to bypass Walmart, Target, Best Buy, and so forth. You already see the steady decline and demise of a lot of specialty music and movie stores. Well, that's just going to have to continue as this happens. Same thing with digital books and bookstores. Those places will have to find other things to draw people in with different products, or different types of products even, to be able to keep their doors open. It's what's called a market disruption in economics, something that is causing a major change that is shifting things around. We're in the midst of that market disruption. Will that disruption eventually end with the complete phasing out of physical media? I doubt it. But I imagine the percentage of physical media will continue to dwindle to the point where it is mostly a collector's type field. Another one from Addie Marvin that I missed in that earlier group of questions from Addie Marvin. Seeing as your secondary focus seems to be on UK home video releases, do you plan on collecting all of those as well down the line? All of them? No, not really. I mean, I might start delving more into it, but what I find is that a lot of times when there's something interesting that deviates from American releases, the UK is the easiest place for me to find that stuff because it is English language and so forth. Australia would be another place to perhaps look to and that sort of thing. But no, I mean, I'm not planning on getting all of them or anything like that. Our last question here is from the Fazani Ferengi, who asks, is Star Wars a culture conf topic now? How long will this last if you think that it is? Now, he says culture conf, presumably he's not talking about the actual culture conf, right? The Otto von Bismarck versus the Catholic Church thing, late 1800s, Prussia/Germany kind of thing. And he's using it in the modern parlance of basically taking that to mean culture war, how it translates, and referring to sort of the political right, political left, conservative versus liberal, etc., social values type of conflict that's going on in the world, and particularly in the United States at this point. Presumably that's what's being referred to. Things that include issues like diversity, abortion, Islamic extremism and what you call it, war on terrorism stuff, gay rights, gay marriage, gay adoption, gender identity, all those types of things all sort of lumped into this gigantic topic of sort of culture war. as it was defined by, among others, people like former Fox News host Bill O'Reilly and others. In other words, is Star Wars part of this charged political environment and a topic of that type of discussion now? And my answer would be yes, but individually, kind of only if you let it be, to some extent, if you let that intrude on your fandom. So I'm somebody who teaches social studies classes for a living. I follow all of this social stuff, political stuff, and everything. So to me, I always find it interesting to look at how culture influences art and vice versa. So for me, it's interesting, for instance, if we're talking about the Aftermath trilogy, particularly the prevalence of gay characters in the Aftermath trilogy, Sinjir, Rath Bayless, and others, I find it interesting to delve into that with an eye towards what are Chuck Wendig's politics, his political views, his social views, to what extent was he, or Del Rey, or Disney, or Star Wars, Lucasfilm, whoever, trying to push an agenda in putting Sinjir into the story, or Eliodie Matakavanya, the gender identity politics character, you could call her in the after, or her/him/Zher, as referred to as Zher, Z-H-E-R, the gender-neutral pronoun in the book. To what extent can that be seen as part of that broader discussion? And I think it's interesting because you can get into context that you otherwise wouldn't get into, and get into deeper topics with some of these Star Wars topics than you otherwise would. And there's a lot of different ways you can come at these issues. It's not a binary thing where something is either right or wrong, left or right, black or white. A lot of times it's something where it's okay, well, you know, from a political standpoint, how would people on the right see the inclusion of these characters in Aftermath? How would people on the left see it? What is the impact on fans? What is the impact on the story? Does it have an economic impact on the story itself? What does it say for Star Wars in general, pop culture, science fiction? What does it say about Chuck Wendig? Lots of cool areas of discussion you can get into when you look at this broader social context in which the books are being written, the movies are being made, and so forth. That said, there's also a dark side to that. Because right now, politically, at least in the United States, we're probably as divided as we've ever been. You take about the last, I'd say probably about the last 20 years, 15 years, we are incredibly divided, very balkanized, very tribalized. We're all kind of in our own little corners. There aren't a lot of people in the middle calling for reason and intellectual honesty. It's all insanity. It's all extremes on one side or the other. For instance, you take the current controversy about the Paris Climate Accords and whatnot, and the issue of climate change. Now, in this case, it's something that happens to be something where the left is looked at negatively. You can see the same thing on the right, but on different issues. But in this case, for instance, climate change. If you are on the political left, you believe the climate is changing. If you're on the political right, you also generally believe the climate is changing. There aren't many people in the world, scientists or otherwise, who actually believe the climate is actually staying exactly the same and steady throughout, that it's all status quo. The questions in the climate change debate are more like, not is the climate changing, but stuff like, to what degree has human action influenced the changing climate? To what degree has our contribution been negative instead of positive? Where it's been negative, or where climate change may be negative, to what extent can humans affect that in a positive way and fix things, if at all, and if so, in what ways? What's going to be the most effective and most efficient? Those really sort of more nuanced questions. But instead, how it's presented in the media is, do you believe climate change is real? Yes or no? If you are on the left, you are on the climate change bandwagon. If you are on the right, then you are a climate denier, a term designed to evoke the Holocaust denial concept. That was the only other major political instance in which you'd see something labeled as something denier, at least around the time that that term, climate change denier, entered American parlance. We don't look at things in nuanced questions and try to actually have a conversation about issues so much as we just watch either side go to an extreme and start flinging feces at each other from the other side, hoping that their feces hits the mark first, and that in that day's 24-hour news cycle, they look like the good guys, and the other side looks like the bad guys. Unfortunately, because that is so prevalent in the culture right now, yes, Star Wars gets dragged into it, as do any other things out there. For example, the newer Star Trek films. Oh my God, Sulu's gay! It's part of an agenda. We should boycott this. No, we should support this, etc., etc. You know, it may have just become George Takei himself is gay, played the original Sulu, and they wanted to make an homage to him. Or maybe it was a diversity thing for the story, and you can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but is it really something to be grabbing your pitchforks and torches about that Sulu's gay and it's shown in like a 10-second scene in the newest Star Trek film? We gotta choose our battles, right? What is worth getting worked up about and what is not? And these days it tends to be that everything is worth getting worked up about, no matter what it is. So for Star Wars, it's stuff like, oh my God, there are female leads in all these Star Wars major female characters, and oh my God, Rogue One is more diverse. Or, flip it around, yay, there's more female leads for Star Wars, and woohoo, and more diverse cast for Rogue One. When really it should be able to be having a conversation about gender diversity in Star Wars, or racial diversity in Star Wars, or accent diversity in Star Wars. And instead it becomes sort of a pick your side, cheerlead for your side, and throw feces at the other side. Sadly, Star Wars has been caught up in that. But even though social media is prevalent right now, even though you see all the insanity going around in society around you, and I take this advice to heart myself, you are in control of your own life. As Qui-Gon put it, your focus determines your reality. You can choose whether or not to get sucked into this black hole of that kind of bullshit, or whether you can sit back and say, you know what, Star Wars is a hobby, it is something I enjoy, it is an escapism thing, I will delve into what I find interesting, and the stupid stuff around me, I won't let myself be dragged into it. In internet parlance, I won't feed the trolls, nor will I be a troll myself. You can choose to be one of the rational people while the storm is raging, sitting there in the eye of the hurricane. Thankfully, I think there are probably more people who would like to do that than otherwise. There may be more people doing it than otherwise. But remember the general adage that when it comes to controversy, the rational people who are kind of like, whatever, are usually the quiet ones, and the ones who are loudest are the ones who are angrily on either side because they've got something to be pissed about, rational or not. So yeah, Star Wars has been dragged into it, but you don't have to let it pervade your Star Wars experience. How long will it go on? I honestly don't know at what point we're going to see society move past this kind of extremism of everyone's perspective and the my opinion trumps yours, etc., kind of stuff. And given that, until society calms the hell down in terms of that kind of stuff, I don't see Star Wars calming down in that regard. You could say that in some respects it started with the Disney buyout thing and how that divided fandom. But I think that really only just exacerbated the situation that was already going to be coming to Star Wars because of all the cultural changes. Pick a fandom. Firefly, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Star Trek, Strawberry Shortcake, friggin' Smurfs. There is culture comp bullshit attached to all of it now because we're not willing as a society to simply let entertainment be entertainment anymore. It always has to have some sinister overtone that it's purposely playing into the cultural stuff. Sci-fi is great when it reflects the culture. Sci-fi can make us think better and more deeply about cultural issues without offending people. And yes, social issues and opinions will often influence the artists behind science fiction in how they tell their stories and what they do, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. It doesn't necessarily mean that Star Wars or any other franchise has to be a front line of cultural conflict. It's supposed to be entertainment, but, you know, that's just rational people talking, the voice of reason or lack thereof talking here. What the hell do I know? We're gonna have the best blasters, the best frigates, this I can tell you, and we're gonna put a wall around the new capital to keep out the First Order, because they are murderers and rapists and so on. Let me be clear. That is some crazy shit. I see that as part of the new continuity. Continuous nuity. Part of the new story. I'm glad to see all the women taking prominent positions in Star Wars. Women around the country have felt underrepresented, and I tell you, I feel your pain. And your boobies. Gentlemen, ask not what your Star Wars can do for you, but what you can do for the Star Wars community. Namely, keep out the politics, enjoy it, and shut up about the stupid shit. Anyway, sorry. I'll stop with the stupid president impressions now. It's a little too much, Wouldn't be prudent at this juncture. Sorry. Anyway. With that pretty much is all the questions. Thank you to everybody who provided them. And again, if you want to put in new questions, put them in the comments below, and I'll hold them for a future Q&A. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Be sure to check out A Saga on Home Video, A Fan's Guide to U.S. Star Wars Home Video Releases, my new book, available on Amazon and elsewhere. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with you.